Yeah.
Okay, this week's Sedra is Acharei, and this is one of those years when Acharei and Doshim are read on 2 different weeks. We don't combine the Sedras this year. But what's interesting is, for us in the Chutz Laaretz, for us in outside the land of Israel, so this past Shabbos was part of Pesach. It was the last day of Pesach, because in Chutz Laaretz, outside the land of Israel, there is an extra day of Pesach, because at the time when they used to declare the new month on the basis of the calendar, it took a while till the Jewish communities outside the land of Israel knew which day Pesach would be. So because of this, they observed the first day and consequently the last day of Pesach for 2 days, because there was a doubt. And even though today we have a calendar, today we know exactly when Pesach would fall out, but the Chachamim instituted, because maybe the situation will change, whatever it is, but the Chachamim instituted that the practice that existed in those days should continue. So because of that, last Shabbos, this past Shabbos, yesterday, for the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, it was a regular Shabbos. So they lamed Acharei. Next Shabbos, they will lame Doshim. However, for us, we read the Kriya, that parts of the Torah that deal with the part of the Torah that deals with the reading of Yontif. Consequently, we are 1 week behind the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And we're not going to catch up to them till Parshas Matos Masai, which is about 2 Shabboses before Tisha B'av. Now, the question is, why is it that we wait so long? After all, there are many Sedras between now and the summer period when Tisha B'av falls out, that we could couple the Sedras. For example, there is besides Acharei and Doshim, there's Bahar B'chukosai, there's Chukas Balak, and we keep these Sedras separate. Why don't we one Shabbos couple 2 Sedras, so we shouldn't have to wait so long to be on the same page with the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. Now I think there is a very simple answer, and then I'm going to suggest another answer, but I think both answers ultimately might even boil down to the same idea, and both answers have to be explained. The Rambam, he raises a question. It's a question that everybody understands. The question is, why do we, the Jews of Chutz Laaretz, have to observe 2 days of Shavuos? We understand why we have to observe 2 days of Pesach, of the first days and of the last days. We understand why we have to observe 2 days of the first days of Sukkot and 2 days of Shmini Atzeres. Because we don't know what day the was established as Rosh Chodesh, as was established as the first of the month. If we don't know which day, when I say we don't know, it means the Jews outside Eretz Yisrael, outside the land of Israel, did not know. And the same thing certainly applies to Rosh Hashanah. The Jews outside Eretz Yisrael did not know which day, but Rosh Hashanah anyway, and even in Eretz Yisrael they observed 2 days for a special reason. The Jews that lived outside the land of Israel, they did not know why we observe that which day was proclaimed as the first of the month until messengers from the Bezdin would go out and get to their communities to let them know which day was proclaimed as the first of the month. So consequently, when the 15th of the month came, they didn't know which day was the 15th. They didn't know if the previous month had 29 days or the previous month had 30 days. So they had to observe 2 days. And because they had to observe 2 days Yom Tov, we too have to observe 2 days Yom Tov. But Shavuos, yes, we always observe Shavuos on the 6th of Sivan. But in the time of the Gemara, when they didn't have the calendar, in the earlier periods of time of the Gemara, when they didn't have a calendar, and certainly prior to that, when the declaration of the holiday of the new moon, the new month, was made by sighting of the new moon, and by Bezdin proclaiming that it's Rosh Chodesh. So Shavuos it could have been on the 5th of the month, it could have been on the 6th of the month, and it could have been on the 7th of the month. Shavuos is dependent upon 50 days, the 50th day from the second day of Pesach. 50 days from the second day of Pesach. So the question is, since it's dependent upon 50 days from the second day of Pesach, by that time, 50 days after the second day of Pesach, all the Jewish communities at that time already were informed when was the right proper day for the Pesach holiday. Since they were informed what was the proper day for the Pesach holiday, they knew automatically which day would be Shavuos, because Shavuos was not in theory dependent upon a particular day of the month, but it was dependent upon 50 days from the second day of Pesach. And Pesach is Nisan. They didn't know which day. Initially, they didn't know which day was the beginning of Nisan. They didn't know which day was the beginning. Perhaps they didn't know which day was the beginning of Iyar, but although they probably did, but at a certain point, they certainly knew. By the time Sivan came around, they knew which day would be. They might not have known the date, but they knew which day would be 50 days from the second day of Pesach. So the Rambam asked the question, so why do we observe Shavuos 2 days? Why do we observe Shavuos 2 days? So the Rambam says, Shelo lachlok b'moados, in order not to make a difference between the holiday of Shavuos and the other holidays. So in a sense, we have to treat Shavuos, the Rambam says, as if we have a doubt as to which day Shavuos should be, even though, in fact, we have no doubt. But we don't want to make a difference between one holiday and the other. And since we don't want to make a difference between one holiday and the other, so we have to observe 2 days of Shavuos. Now, so we could understand it. In other words, we could understand that when the Chachamim instituted that the holiday of Shavuot should be observed as if we have a doubt, that means that the whole duration from Pesach till Shavuos, even though in fact we knew which day was proclaimed as Rosh Chodesh, we have to act as if we don't know. And since we act as if we didn't know which day was proclaimed as Rosh Chodesh, even though in fact we do know which day is Rosh Chodesh, consequently, when it comes to the reading of the Torah, we have to act as if we don't know when the people of Eretz Yisrael read these kriyos, read these portions in the Torah. So in deciding what portion of the Torah we are to read, the Chachamim said we have to act as if we don't know which day, whether Pesach, let's say, if it would be like this year, ended on Shabbos, the last day of Pesach in Eretz Yisrael was on Shabbos, or the last day of Pesach was on Friday. So that's one answer, but we have to understand why it was so important for the Chachamim in deciding which day we should read what parshios to have this attitude, to have this approach. Now, I think I want to suggest another possible answer. And but I want to bring another question. The Torah and others bring in the name of the Gonim that there was a custom not to do work, not to do work during Sfiras HaOmer, and two reasons at night. And two reasons are given for it. One reason given for it is because during the period of Sfiras HaOmer, that commemorates the tragedy of the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva, who died in a plague, Aspera. And because of the Roman occupation that existed at that time, they were only able to take the bodies out for burial at night. And because the bodies were taken out at night from the city to the cemetery, the law was that when someone is being buried, when we're aware of the people who are being buried, and certainly the students of Rabbi Akiva were people that everybody was aware about, so you're not allowed to do work. And because of that, in a sort of way to go through that re-experience. So there was a custom not to do work during the evenings of Sfiras HaOmer. And some say that according to that reason, it wasn't just the beginning of the night. It was the whole night of Sfiras HaOmer. But then another reason is given, and there are all kinds of versions of this reason and all kinds of texts. I'm not going to go into detail about it because that will require a whole shir in itself. But because it represents the Torah in talking about Sfiras HaOmer says Sheva Shapshasos Tamimos Tiyena, that you shall count 7 weeks, and it refers to the weeks as Shapsasos. So consequently, because of that, we refrain from doing work. We refrain from doing work at the time of the Sfira, because Shabbos we don't do work. They mention even Shemitah every 7th year. It also uses the expression Shabbosos. There it's only the 7th year, but I have a whole explanation about it. But because it's a day, it's identified with Shabbos, it's identified with Shemitah. So we refrain from doing work, but according to this opinion, the poskim say we refrain from work only at the beginning of the night, from the beginning of nightfall until the counting of Sfiras Omer, until the actual counting of the Omer. So we have to understand. What's the logic behind this? And now, in order to explain it, I want to mention, maybe I should have discussed the Chol Hamoed. There is a whole dispute as to whether a person should wear tefillin on Chol Hamoed or not. Now, what's the general rule? Again, I'm not going into details. The general rule is that Shabbos and Yom Tov, we do not wear tefillin. Why don't we wear tefillin? Well, there's discussion about it. But according to Rabbi Akiva, the reason we don't wear tefillin is because Shabbos is an os, Shabbos is a sign, Yom Tov is a sign. The question is, and tefillin are a sign. So because tefillin is a sign, we don't wear tefillin on days that they themselves are a sign. Torah employs the word os in regard to Shabbos, in regard to Yom Tov, and consequently we don't wear tefillin on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So the question is Chol Hamoed also a sign, or Chol Hamoed is not a sign? So there are those who say that work on Chol Hamoed, there are certain forms of work that are prohibited on Chol Hamoed. It's not like Yom Tov, but there are those who say that those forms of work are prohibited biblically. Well, if they're prohibited biblically, so that's the biblical prohibition of doing certain forms of work on Chol Hamoed is a sign in itself. And since it's a sign, so we are prohibited. So because of that, we do not put tefillin on Chol Hamoed. But there are those who say no. The prohibition against some forms of work on Chol Hamoed is only rabbinic. Consequently, it couldn't stop us from being required to put on tefillin. But they say, Chol Hamoed, true, there is no biblical prohibition of doing work on Chol Hamoed, but there are mitzvos that are associated with the days of Chol Hamoed, just as they are associated with Yom Tov. Chol Hamoed, Sukkos, we eat in the sukkah. We take lulav and esrog. Chol Hamoed, Pesach, we refrain from eating chametz. We eat matzah, whether there's a mitzvah to eat matzah and the Chol Hamoed or only the first night, that's a discussion. But there are halachos, mitzvos, dinim, laws that are special laws that are associated biblically with those days. Consequently, they're considered days that have a sign. So there is a prohibition of doing work. So there is we do not put on tefillin. Those who say that we do put on tefillin, so on one hand, they say we put on tefillin because their opinion is that work on Chol Hamoed is only rabbinic. Prohibition of doing work is only rabbinic. And they say, as far as the special mitzvos of the day is concerned, that is not enough of a sign to make us exempt, to make us exempt from putting on tefillin. Consequently, their opinion is that we have to put on tefillin. So the Mishkenes Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Karlina, he was considered the outstanding student of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. The Mishkenes Yaakov asks a question. He says, Rashi's opinion, in numerous places, certainly throughout all of Moed Katan, but in other places as well, is that work in Chol Hamoed is prohibited biblically. And at the same time, Rashi's opinion is that one puts on tefillin on Chol Hamoed. Rashi in Sukkah says that you put on tefillin on Chol Hamoed. So the question is, what's the sign? Is the sign the prohibition to do work? So the forms of work that are prohibited on Chol Hamoed are biblically prohibited according to Rashi. The mitzvahs of the day are there, according to Rashi, according to everybody. Some would say it's the sanctity of the day. Reb Chaim would say the Chol Hamoed certainly has a sanctity of the day. So why is it that Rashi says you put on tefillin? He holds biblically you can't do certain forms of work. He's of the opinion, everybody knows that there are mitzvahs that are associated with the day. Why does he say you put on tefillin? The Mishkenes Yaakov gives an answer, but I don't want to, I'll quickly say, Mishkenes Yaakov's answer is that Yontif is called Shabbos. We say in Sphira, Usfartem lachem mimachas haShabbos. You shall count from the day after the Shabbos. And we know we start counting Sphira on the second day of Pesach. So we see Shabbos is used in reference to the first day of Pesach. It's used in reference to Yontif. Chol Hamoed, even if malacha, even if work is prohibited, but Shabbos it's not. Yontif is considered a Shabbos. The os, the sign, is the fact that the day is considered like a Shabbos. That's what he said. I want to suggest another answer, but you could use my answer perhaps to understand the Mishkenes Yaakov as well. Now, one can make a chakira, if I could use that word. There are two approaches. We have holidays. Sukkot is an 8-day holiday. And Pesach is a 7-day holiday. Now, and each holiday begins with a yontif and ends with a yontif. But you have the Chol Hamoed, which is called, I think, the intermediary days in between. How are we to understand? There are two ways to understand this concept of an 8-day holiday that has a yontif at the beginning and a yontif at the end. One way to understand it, and it appears that the Bach had that attitude, according to the Maharil, is that it's a general rule in the Torah that if you have an 8-day holiday, so it should begin with a yontif and end with a yontif. But it's the holiday that causes the yontif. The Bach says that there was a custom, and he said he finds foundations for it in the Gemara. There was a custom not to do work on Hanukkah, on the first day of Hanukkah and on the last day of Hanukkah. So we could, there are a number of possible explanations, but one explanation is because since biblically, whenever you have a 7 or 8 day holiday, it begins with a prohibition of doing work. and ending with a prohibition of doing work. So a custom developed to refrain from doing work. I don't know anybody that observes it, but a custom developed to refrain from doing work on the first day of Hanukkah and on the last day of Hanukkah. However, there's a much simpler approach, and that does not work out with the Shita, with the opinion of the Bach and the Maharil. And that is that actually the purpose of Chol HaMoed is to connect the 2 days, of the two yontifs, the two yontifs. So it's only to serve as a connection. So in a sense, if it's only to serve as a connection, the significance of Chol HaMoed does not come from the day itself. Work could be prohibited biblically on Chol HaMoed. There could be mitzvos during Chol HaMoed. But the reason there are mitzvos, the reason work is prohibited, is because it connects 2 holidays. In Sukkot, it connects the first day of Sukkot, which means Atzeres, and in Pesach, it connects Shvi Shel Pesach with the first day of Pesach. So the significance of Chol HaMoed doesn't come from the importance of the days itself, but from the days that it connects. So we could say it's only a nos, it's only a sign that prevents the mitzvah of tefillin being applicable if the special status it has in Jewish law is because of the significance of the day itself. But if the significance is because it is a connection between the first 2 days, or it emanates from the first day, whichever way you want to say, then it's not considered a nos to prevent the putting on of mitzvahs of tefillin. Now, if we say that, and I have a proof, an indication that Chol HaMoed is to be seen as a connection between the 2 days, the days of Yontif. The Ramban says that the holiday, the Ramban says that actually Shavuos is like the Shmini Atzeres of Pesach. And he says that the weeks of Sfiras HaOmer, now this is certainly not a halachic point, but from a Kabbalah standpoint, the weeks of Sfiras HaOmer, the 7 weeks of Sfiras HaOmer, that is like the Chol HaMoed that connects the first days of Pesach with Shavuos. Since it's like the Chol HaMoed that connects the first days of Pesach with Shavuos, so we see that the purpose of Chol HaMoed is to connect the holidays. Now, if we say that, we can understand the opinion of the Gonen, that just why the custom developed, or the custom developed to not to do work, is because a practice developed in some form or shape to treat the days of Sfiras HaOmer as if it was Chol HaMoed, as it linked the first day of Pesach with Shavuos. And since it linked the first days of Pesach with Shavuos, just as a result of that linkage, work was prohibited on Chol HaMoed even from the Torah. So the custom developed not to do work in the evening of Sfiras HaOmer. Why specifically the evening? Because when it comes to Yontif, Chol HaMoed is the day that connects it. But we could say when it comes to Sfiras HaOmer, it's the counting of the Omer that connects it. So from the time the mitzvah of counting begins until the time you count it. The custom developed not to do work during at the evenings of Sfiras Omer. Now, we could say that in a certain sense, and there are other proofs for this also, that Chol Hamoed is to be seen as part of Pesach. Since Chol Hamoed is to be seen as part of Pesach, in any place where Pesach was observed, this would be an alternative explanation to the Rambam. In any place where Pesach is observed 2 days, the first days of Pesach are observed 2 days. So the conclusion of the holiday, the conclusion being Shavuos, also has to be observed 2 days. And since we have to, so in a sense, it's the we have to see the first 2 days of Pesach. We have to see the first 2 days of Pesach, each as being the first day of Pesach. Consequently, we have to emphasize that point by having a second day of Shavuos, and because of that, we keep the Sedrus as if we did not yet know which was the first day of Pesach. Now, we have to understand this, though. What's the logic behind all of this? I think the logic behind all of this is based on the Medrash Rav Kahana, Psikta Rav Kahana. The Psikta Rav Kahana says that just like there are 50 days between Pesach and Shavuos, there should have been 50 days between Sukkot, the first day of Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeres. But why did the Chachamim say that you don't need 50 days between that? Not Chachamim, the Torah. Why did the Torah not require 50 days to separate Sukkot, the first day of Sukkot, with Shmini Atzeres? That's because if the Torah had done that, the Jew would have been required to return to Yerushalayim in the middle of the rainy season. And the Torah, in a sense, was sensitive to the difficulty in tracking back to Yerushalayim during the rainy season. Consequently, the Torah attached Shmini Atzeres. The Torah attached Shmini Atzeres to Sukkot. But in theory, there should have been 50 days between both. And the question is, why should there be 50 days? What is the significance of 50 days? And I think the significance of 50 days is that the significance of 50 days, where do we find 50? We find 50 by Yovel, the Jubilee year. There are 50 years. In a certain sense, each day represents a year. And the Jubilee year represents the entering into a new era. What's the difference between Pesach and Shavuos on one hand, and Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres on the other hand? And there is a famous question everybody asks: why is it that Shavuos has no symbols attached to it? Sukkot has the sukkah Pesach has matzah. It has the prohibition of chametz. Shavuos, in terms, I'm not talking in the Beis Hamikdash, but I'm talking in our daily lives. There are no symbols. Why is it that there are no symbols? And the truth of the matter is that Shmini Atzeres also doesn't have symbols. Why is that? And I think the reason is because Shavuos is not a holiday of history. Shavuos is the holiday of today. And today began with Matan Torah. We say in the Haggadah, "V'achshav kervanu hamacham la'avodaso." God now brought us close to his service. Now he brought us close to his service. He brought us close to the service of Matan Torah. Perhaps from the Haggadah it appears it has reference to the time of Avraham Avinu. Why is it called V'achshav, and now? In other words, sometimes the now began a long time ago. You have errors. So Pesach is the past. Pesach, we go back in time. We go back in time. Matan Torah is not a celebration of the past. Matan Torah is a celebration of the era of Torah that began with Matan Torah, with the giving of the Torah. 50 symbolizes the idea of going from one era to another era. And the same thing is true about Sukkot. Sukkot commemorates the Jewish people. Going into Sukkot commemorates the Jewish people traversing the desert, being travelers in the desert, almost like nomads. And what is Shmini Atzeres? Where did the Jews live in the desert, in sukkahs, in huts, in temporary dwellings? And Pesach and Shmini Atzeres, we go from our temporary dwelling into our permanent dwelling. And what is the permanent dwelling of the Jew? The permanent dwelling of the Jew is Eretz Yisrael. So, and this is the era of Eretz Yisrael. It's true that we are in Golus, we are in exile, but that's a deviation from the way things should have been. When we entered with Yoshua, we should have stayed in Eretz Yisrael forever. So this is the era of Eretz Yisrael. This is the era of the present. Pesach and Sukkot represents us re-experiencing the past. Shmini Atzeres and Shavuos. That's when we are in the present, looking forward to the future. And that's why we don't need symbols. We need symbols to re-experience the past. But we don't need symbols for the present. So because of that, there are no symbols on Shmini Atzeres to emphasize that we're dealing with the present, and there are no symbols on Shavuos because it's emphasizing the present. Now, what is the logic? Now, in order to understand this thought, I think we have to take notice of Acharei Moshe. Now, you take a look at the end of Acharei Moshe. You have the Parsha of Arayos, forbidden relationships, incest, adultery, and a few other prohibitions. And the Torah warns us that if you practice these, if you violate these prohibitions, so the Jewish people might be spit out of Eretz Yisrael. There's some that explain the pasuk a little different, but the simple reading of the Torah is that if we want to stay in Eretz Yisrael, we have to be careful about forbidden relationships. And the question is, apparently there's some special connection between Eretz Yisrael and forbidden relationships, or the negation, how one negates the other. We could say very simply, because we left Egypt in order to become a separate nation. And if we follow the practices of the Egyptians, we're not fulfilling the purpose of Eretz Yisrael, which was given to us to become a separate nation. And Canaan, to be a separate nation, not to let to be a different nation than the people that lived there before us. But I think it's more than just that. Now, if you take a look at the beginning of the Sedra of Acharei, so it talks about the service of Yom Kippur. And in talking about the service of Yom Kippurim, the central focus seems to be on the Shnei Sirim, the two goats. There are two goats that looked exactly alike. And the Kohen Gadol would make a gorol, a lottery. And one was Lashem, it was a sacrifice that was given in the Beis HaMikdash. And the other was a sacrifice that really wasn't given in the Beis HaMikdash. There was a person, and the sacrifice was given in the Beis HaMikdash. Who gave the sacrifice? The Kohen Gadol gave, the high Kohen gave the sacrifice on Yom Kippurim. He did all the above on Yom Kippurim. But on the sacrifice of the other goat was taken to the desert in a wagon. And there was an Ish Iti, the Torah tells us. Ish Iti means a man of the time. A man of the time. And there were 10 booths along the way. And there was water and food. Even though it was Yom Kippurim, he was allowed to partake because of the task that he had to take this goat, and the goat was pushed off a mountain. The Mefarshim say that it's some type of, it has to be understood, maybe that it was sort of like pacifying the sorrow shel Esav, the angel of Esav. That has to be explained because it cannot be taken literally. To take it literally would be apikorsis. The sorrow, to pacify the sorrow shel Esav, the minister of Esav. And there is a contrast. My uncle, I think in the early 40s, I think actually it was the third yahrzeit of my grandfather, so about 1944. He gave a shiur, and he contrasted, and he said, "Look at the difference." He says, the animal that was sacrificed in the Beis HaMikdash, it was a special place, and there was significance in place. He represented the idea of significance in place. Korbanos in general, there's a significance in place. You're not allowed to take the korban away from a certain designated place. Sacrifice. It has to be, those korbanos that are eaten, they're eaten in a designated place. Of course, that didn't apply here, but it had to be eaten in a designated place. But the So it talks about the significance of place. It gives importance to the place. The Beis Hamikdash is the holiest of the places. And however, the desert, the goat was taken just over a mountain. The mountain had no special significance. And it was thrown off a mountain. And who did the service in the Beis Hamikdash? Who did the sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash was the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol, especially on Yom Kippur. In a sense, he represented Aaron HaKohen. It wasn't just he himself of this period of time, but he was connected to the Kahuna Dola, to the high priesthood of all the generations. He's even identified sometimes in Yom Kippurim service as Aaron HaKohen. So he's not a man that is designated, that is associated with only a specific moment. He is a figure that continues throughout history. However, the Ishiti, just by definition, what does Ishiti mean? A man of the moment. There are people that only have moments. They have no past and they have no future. Yom Kippurim, a contrast is drawn that we should recognize the difference between what the Ishiti represents. The Ishiti was a traveler. He did not have roots with a specific place. He went from hut to hut. And if I could add, my uncle doesn't say it, to a certain degree, it was somewhat symbolic. Of course, in the Midbar, you had the Mishkan with you. But it was somewhat symbolic of the Jewish people going through the desert, who lived in huts, who had no relationship with specific places. And it was an Ishiti. He only had connection with the moment, with the present, with the fleeting moment of the present. Whereas the Kohen Gadol, he was in the Beis Hamikdash. He was Aaron HaKohen. He was connected with the past generations. And being connected with the past generations, it was a continuum that continues into the future. In a sense, the future Kohanim Dolim. He is the future Kohanim Dolim also. He's not limited by time. And when we deal with Arayas, so we have to understand, when we make a bracha in a wedding, when you make a bracha at a wedding, you make a bracha at a wedding. So Asher Kiddushan Mitzvah the Tzibanu Arayas, Basalanas Rusos, the Hitalanas Nuswano, Adechu Kedushin. There's a connection between the prohibited relationships and the actual marriage itself. Why is that? Well, prohibitions, halachically, there is no relationship with chiyuvei kares, with prohibited relationships. Prohibited relationships are considered encounters, not relationships. There is no sense of permanence. When the Torah, of course, part of the idea of marriage was the idea of building future generations. Obviously, there are situations where that doesn't happen through no one's fault. But those are the type of relationships that are allowed, even if it doesn't produce future generations. Marriage represents the idea of an ongoing relationship. It's not something temporary. People who engage, sometimes in arayos, very often, they go from one booth to another, from one relationship, and I shouldn't even use the word relationship, from one person to another. But there's another thing. The other thing is, when it comes to arayos, when it comes to prohibited relationships, why was the Torah so strict about these relationships? It's so strict because they're impulsive. A person, in a sense, only thinks about the moment. He doesn't think about the past. He doesn't think about the future. He only has that moment. The Gemara in Nadir in Nedarim tells us about the Nazim in Hadaram, that the Shimon HaTzadik considered him to be an outstanding person. And he asked him, why did you accept Nazirus upon yourself to grow your hair long? In those days, growing your hair excessively long was not considered the in thing, stylish. Today, it's the reverse, perhaps. Why did you do such a thing to make yourself look so miserable? And the Nazim in Adarim says, apparently in those days, men didn't look in mirrors. He said he saw his reflection when he went to get some water. He saw his reflection in the water. Apparently he was a very good-looking fellow. The Pachas alai yitzri, my Yetzer Hara, my evil inclinations, quickly grabbed a hold of me. And I was about to go into sin because I saw my potential. So I quickly accepted Nazirus upon myself as a preventive measure. In other words, when it comes to arayos, impulsiveness is the biggest danger of all. Impulsiveness manifests itself in just the moment, in being an ish iti, in being a man of the moment, not even focusing on the past and not focusing on the future. When Yosef was tempted, I would say, just tell us what prevented him. He said, it was the image of his father prevented him from falling prey to the woman of the house who was trying to use him. He was able to focus on the past, and I'm sure focusing on the future. So I think and then also, there's another thing. When it comes to the Maharal, he suggests an interesting explanation. Why is it that the Torah was so stringent about incest? Sounds like a strange question, but he says, there was a tendency in ancient times to intermarry within families. And when you just intermarry within families, the bond that holds different families together, which is necessary for the creation of a nation, become very weak. The Jewish people had to be a strong nation. And to have a strong nation, they needed strong bonds, not just within families, but between families. Consequently, the Torah felt that for the survival of the Jewish people as a nation, there has to be a very strong attitude against incest. And I think, and perhaps that's one of the reasons we could suggest, the Maharal doesn't say it, but one of the reasons we could suggest that we read the Parsha of Arayos in Yom Kippur is because Yom Kippur, we approach God as an individual and as a nation. It's a day of atonement. La Yochid Ula Rabbim, the Rambam says, for the individual as well as for the multitudes, for the nation. When we ask atonement not just for us as individuals. We have a better sense, a better chance of getting atonement from us as a nation as well. So we have to reinforce ourselves as a nation. We have to create strong bonds, not just within families, but between families. So perhaps that's the reason we read the Parsha of Arayos. And similarly, when people act immorally and have relations with a woman who is married to another man. Certainly in those days, there would be no linkage of the generations. No one would know who the father is. The Jewish people, we have to connect past, present, and future. If there was no strong prohibition in Arayos, if everybody was an Ishiti, they only knew the present, they didn't think about the past, they didn't think about the future. So then there would be no linkage of the generations. Eretz Yisrael is what makes the Jewish people as a nation. Of course, it's the Torah, having the Torah, but the Torah gave special recognition to having the land of Eretz Yisrael, even when we're away from it. It's temporary, because that's necessary for us as a nation. That's why perhaps we could suggest that incest is linked with being thrown away from Eretz Yisrael. And I think that that's what we can understand. Pesach, this is the Pesach being identified, Pesach being identified with Shavuos. So if we don't identify Pesach with Shavuos, it's not the true observance of Pesach. And it goes without saying that if we don't identify Shavuos with Pesach, it's not a real Shavuos. And the only way to identify Shavuos with Pesach is to connect the first day of Shavuos with the first day of Pesach, and the second day of Shavuos with the second day of Pesach, which we treated as the first day of Pesach. Because we have to identify the freedom of the Jew with Matan Torah. We have to understand that it's only through the Torah that we are free. And we have to understand on Pesach that we're only free if we have the Torah. There can be no observance of the second day of Pesach unless we know that we're going to observe the second day of Shavuos. And there can be no observance of the second day of Shavuos unless we know that we can observe the second day of Pesach. That's why Shmini Atzeres, that's why Pesach is identified, that's why Shavuos is identified as the Shmini Atzeres of Pesach. And it's in order to emphasize that linkage that the Chachamim said that throughout those weeks in between Pesach and Shavuos, you have to treat it like you didn't know which day is really the first day of Pesach. Because if you don't, then your second day of Shavuos is not a real observance of Shavuos, because the celebration of the second day of Shavuos is dependent on our understanding its connection to Pesach. Okay. I don't know if it's here. I guess. Wait one more minute.